Thanks for stopping by, Brian, for Liberty. I am your host, Brian, and I am on Chapter 3 of Critical Race Theory. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. If you are new to the channel, please hit the like button, subscribe, drop something in the comments so that I know you stopped by to visit, even if it's just a friendly hello. It really helps out with the channel. As you can see, I'm a very small channel trying to grow, just getting started. So I hope you'll take a second, hit that like button, share, subscribe if you really want to stay up to date with the books that I'm going through. I'm not just giving a quick 5-minute review or 10-minute review on these books like you'll get in most channels. I'm actually going chapter by chapter through the book, examining each chapter individually and kind of trying to give you my feedback, point out maybe some of the flaws in the theory itself, as well as some of the things that the book does well. In the first 2 chapters, I was very, very hard on the book, and the reason for that is because there were a lot of false narratives, false information that were presented as factual, and premises built off of that. I have a real hard time with that I believe you're trying to mislead your audience to some extent. If your theory holds water, then you don't have to present false information in order to promulgate that school of thought. It should be able to stand on its merits without using falsehoods to strengthen your argument. Go back, take a look at the first 2 chapters. One video, critical race, the fallacy of critical race theory. The other video, critical race theory, chapter 2. This is critical race theory, chapter 3. And like I said at the beginning, this chapter has a little bit more of value to it, I think. I think there's some stuff we can take away from here that actually can help us further the conversation and get us to a place where we need to be, or at least closer. One of the biggest issues with critical race theory, or trying to get critical race theory out there, getting people to think about racism, institutions that were built to function a certain way. I don't believe that the organization of these entities was created specifically to oppress a specific race, but certainly to reward a particular type of behavior. And that's a different thing, because if it's meant to oppress a particular race, it doesn't matter if you engage in societally acceptable behavior, the system is going to oppress you anyway. If the system is built to reward a specific kind of behavior, then you can look across all the races and say, look, people who adhere to this societally normalized behavior tend to have success, and people who don't do not. Now, you don't have to agree that societal behavior is a good thing, that it should be the norm. That's fine. That's a different conversation. But I think that's part of the problem with critical race theory is they want to point that the discrepancies in society amongst the races are based on race, obviously. And I think that it's more based on behavior. And I think that, statistical studies of economies, if you set race aside and you do breakdowns of where people end up in society, you can backtrack and say, yeah, this behavior creates that outcome. Kind of a little off topic here. The reason I'm here is on this chapter, and the reason I'm saying it brings something of value is whether you agree with this book or not, whether you agree with people who subscribe to critical race theory, the ideas of systemic racism and white privilege and those kinds of things, or you disagree with them, it can only be of value for you to empathize with those people. To be able to say, listen, you've had a unique individual experience, and I'm here to listen to that experience. And if you're looking for a way to create a better path for you, for people like you, I'm here if you want feedback. But first and foremost, I'm here to be empathetic and to hear your story. I think that's very important. Stop attacking the belief system and just listen. So chapter 3 is literally about narratives and storytelling. That's kind of what they go into. And it's a powerful idea because narratives and storytelling open people up to new perspectives by appealing to their curiosity and their desire for a good story, as opposed to attacking their beliefs or imposing your beliefs upon them. So a great example of using stories in this way to create a narrative and to help people better understand is one of the things the book points out is the stories told by former slaves, right, being brought forth now to kind of destroy that idea of Southern genteel plantation life. I mean, let's face it, stop pretending that that's not a thing. I've heard it myself. people saying slavery wasn't as brutal as it's portrayed to be, or slavery this, slavery that. Not necessarily a defense of slavery, but let's say a softening of our view, or an attempt to soften our view of slavery. And that's a terrible thing to do. There's no softening or of slavery. It's slavery. Okay, you are treating another human being like a piece of equipment or as an animal. It doesn't matter if what treatment that person receives, you can't soften around the edges. But if you read these stories, if you look at these stories being told, real stories, I'm not talking about fictional accounts, but real stories, or even like if you read Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? This is firsthand experience, and it paints an honest picture of what was really going on. And the brutality of slavery isn't something we should try and sugarcoat. It's not something that we should try and whitewash, quite frankly, to make descendants of slave owners feel better. Critical race theory is accurate in some of the points that it makes, and that's one of them. There's no good in telling or teaching history in a way that makes people feel less hurt by it. That's not how we move society forward. You have to feel the pain. And the problem with critical race theory is, of course, the other thing that it brings forward is that people today should be held accountable for things they didn't play a role in. That's another argument. But using these stories of former slaves to untell that story of the Southern genteel plantation society, that's when critical race theory talks about that, I think it's making a valid point. The other thing is that, and this is 100% true, it's whether the systems are meant to oppress a particular race or not, the minority experience, the black experience in the United States of America is different than the white experience. It just is. The idea of critical race theory. There are African Americans who oppose critical race theory. There are minorities of all stripes who oppose the teaching of critical race theory. But their reasons for opposing it are probably very different than the opposition on the other side of the aisle, right? From other races, from a white person's perspective. So a black man and a white man can both want to say that we shouldn't be teaching this in our classrooms, but their view may be very different because their experiences are very different. Their perspective of the civil rights movement, which is something we should be teaching, is different. A white person reads or learns about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement and those kinds of things and views it from a very different perspective than a black person. That's undeniable, and that's okay. So it's okay to sit back and listen to another person's perspective, another person's story about their experience learning about these things. And God willing, we'll hear more stories of people who participated in this, and those voices will be brought forward. Not because we need to guilt white people, not because we need to shame white people, but because the story's important in that we need to remember that it is terrible and horrible, and humans are capable of terrible and horrible things. And we need to tell these stories so that we remember that, and that we remember that race, religion, any arbitrary distinction we decide to label each other with can lead to very, very bad outcomes, very horrible things. I look at our society today and how we're dividing each other up. The vaxxed and the unvaxxed is and we're going to treat each other horribly over this new distinction that we're making. And I don't want to get into an argument here about, well, you're harming. I don't want to get into that argument. I'm just saying that labeling and slapping labels on people and saying we're going to divide ourselves, we're going to be this group and that group and that group, and we're going to treat each other differently. That's how you get slavery. That's how you get genocide. That's how you get segregation. That's how these horrible things happen. So we need to learn some of the lessons that critical race theory has to teach, but it's not teaching the most valuable lesson, which is these arbitrary differences are stupid, they're foolish, and most importantly, they're incredibly dangerous. So the narrative part of this is, I think, very good. When they talk about telling stories as a way to bring reality forward and make people, and they don't really hit the empathy side of it, but to make people empathetic to a person's perspective. That's a better. Here's an example of why I believe what I believe is a lot better than this is the way things are, and you should believe it too, or you're a terrible racist. So it's important to it's a much more effective way of communicating. Here's a problem that I have with this section, though. It talks about that, the whitewashed version of slavery in America. Okay, the problem is it tries to pull, and this is the problem with critical race theory, and this is the problem with the systemic racism idea and the white privilege idea, is it tries to pull all of that into today and say this historically accurate piece of information is why this demographic variance is happening in society today. And that's not true. That's a false, and that's an incredibly important issue and an incredibly important thing to keep in mind, because it skirts over and discounts an incredibly important period in Black history in the United States. From 1930 to the culmination of the Civil Rights Movement, I would say the culmination of the Civil Rights Movement as we're taught it in 1970, right? It discounts a huge portion of Black history. And that 40-year period really takes white privilege, systemic racism, and all of those different things and says, this may not be quite as true of a story as we think it is. These things may not all tie together back to Jim Crow and slavery the way that the proponents of this and the activists around it would like you to believe. And what I mean by that, one of the examples is when you talk about systemic racism, one of the things you hear about is redlining. Redlining happened, and it was a terrible thing. It was incredibly racist, and it became illegal in I can't remember the exact year. I would say 1969, 1970, somewhere in that range. The practice of redlining was something we did away with. The Great Migration, which is the Black movement from the South to the industrialized North into manufacturing jobs, into city centers, happened during that period from 1930 to 1970, when redlining was an actual thing, when it was a legal practice, when Jim Crow was still on the books. This is an incredibly important thing. If I could make a point and pound on the desk here, this is an incredibly important thing to take away from this video. The Great Migration, the movement of Blacks to pursue economic opportunity in the largest possible numbers, took place from the 1930s to the 1970s. In addition to that, the income gap between Blacks and their white counterparts closed at the greatest amount, at the greatest rate from the 30s to the 70s. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's all front-loaded after the Civil Rights Act. It's not. I've studied this. I've actually done a video on it. I went searching for the video, by the way, and I couldn't find it in my library. So I may do a whole nother video on that. It's another great reason to hit subscribe. I will not just be doing book stuff here. I will go back and do some historical stuff. I will also hit headlines. So I do a lot of different things on this channel. So if you take a minute, hit the like button and subscribe. So when I put a new video up, you never know what you're going to get, but it's always going to have a libertarian or political type bend to it. So just throw that out there. I may redo that video to kind of illustrate this period from the 1930s to the 1970s, because I think it's a very important part of Black history, and it's a part that critical race theory tends to ignore. And the modern movement, this modern systemic racism, white privilege type movement for equity of outcome, is ignoring the incredible accomplishments of the Black family from 1930 to 1970. And I say the Black family because if you look at all from a statistical perspective, from 1930 to 1970, there is a great deal of stability in the Black family. Divorce rates, single motherhood rates, all those things were very much in line, not quite at the exact same level, but very much in line with their white counterparts. The Black single motherhood rate in 1969, I want to say, was 5% to, I think, 2.5% amongst whites. Right there, a couple of percentage points. So you hear a lot of times that the destruction of the Black family took place during slavery, and that period from 30 to 70, that tells you that that's not necessarily true. The Black family was still intact. Through some of the worst racial history of our country, the Black family stayed intact. The black family was able to move. The black family was able to improve its economic circumstance. And since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the black family has collapsed. The single motherhood rate has exponentially grown, and the increase or the reduction of the gap between black families and white families has virtually stagnated. That's something to think about. 1930, 1970, horrible racism, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, but the black family intact, financial situation improving, all those things happening. And then after those things became illegal, after we desegregated, after we ended redlining, after we ended all those things, that's when the black family went into decline. So it kind of offsets that narrative. So we have to take a minute and we have to step back and say, why did that happen? And again, this is in my other video, and I will get into these factors in another video. So once again, please subscribe, like, share the content, get into the comment section. Let me know how, hey, if you think I'm way off base or if I'm missing something important, let me know. I'm here to share my opinions, but I'm also here to learn and to open some dialogue, hopefully. But I look at essentially three major causes of what kind of happened here and why that happened. First and foremost is the advent of the welfare system. So you had a bunch of black families living in the inner city. And at the same time that welfare, right around the time welfare, we started moving manufacturing away from the cities. That kind of, the 1970s was a period of the end of that type of manufacturing. I'm going to graduate high school, go get a job in the factory, and so on and so forth. We kind of ended that. And when you throw welfare on top of that, somebody who's newly unemployed starts getting a check from the government, and dependence is a thing that happens. It creeps in and happens fast. So I think welfare, the advent of the welfare, was probably the worst timing to create a welfare state, was right at that moment when we were going through this economic turmoil, because the black family had already proven their incredible resilience and desire to succeed from 30 to 70 by moving and following this path to close this economic inequality gap between themselves and their white counterparts. Then why did that not continue? And I would say the only thing that would have interrupted that desire is the advent of a welfare state. Women's liberation. Let's not pretend that didn't play some kind of a role in it. Let's not pretend that when we started determining that we didn't need a nuclear family, that man's role in the family wasn't as important as it had traditionally been determined to be, that didn't lead to higher levels of single motherhood. Combine that with a government that financially replaces the father in the house at that time. And I think at that point, you also had the birth of what is modern wokeism. If you're not familiar, I would take a look at the Moynihan report that came out right around that time. And it talked about some of these issues that were just starting to creep into the black family. And it was immediately attacked as racist. It wasn't racist. It was an examination of statistical fact and things that were happening in the black family at that time. And instead of addressing it and trying to solve the actual problem, they called it racist. And if you look at every attempt to say this is what's going on in these communities, we're not going to address the issue. We're going to call that kind of speech racist, and we're not going to try and solve the actual problem. So I think that there are solutions to some of these problems. I think that we need to get to a graduated welfare and food stamp program. I think that these need to be time-limited programs. I also think that we need to set up a scenario where we are moving people away from the inner cities. Here's a kind of a radical view, maybe, is that the reason we have a welfare system, the reason we have a welfare state, is so that poor people can stay in the city and serve rich white people. How about that? How about that for an idea? How about the fact that you could live on the wages you're earning in your low income area, inner city, that's violent and has a crappy school? If you left, you could earn wages. If you're at the lower end of the income spectrum, you could earn wages like that living in an area that's more rural with significantly lower cost of living, and better schools for your children, but the welfare system keeps poor people in the inner city. Why? Because rich white people need to go. And I don't like saying rich white people. I shouldn't say that. Shame on me. Rich people who live in the city need poor people to serve them. And so we'll create a welfare system that encourages them to stay here instead of leaving. And their kids will go to crappy schools, and their kids will grow up uneducated with little opportunity. And so for me, I would say let's exchange welfare for job search and relocation assistance. Get the hell out of there. Don't hold on to this idea of I got to stay in this community. Get the hell out of there. Move. I live in South Carolina, and I'm telling you, there are jobs, and the cost of living down here is low. And I know it's the South, it's the racist South. Well, I'm a person of color, and I'm doing just fine down here. And I haven't seen it. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's plenty of places you can live with a significantly lower cost of living than a major city center. And that's going to create a lot better opportunity for your children, where there's going to be better schools because you're not trapped in this densely populated low-income area of an inner city. I say get out. And the other thing is we all need to start doing a better job, myself included. This is something that's on my list, is to get involved in a mentoring program. I have tried twice to get into Big Brothers Big Sisters here where I'm at, and there is not enough funding right now for Big Brothers Big Sisters in my area, which is something I want to start working on. Once I get my platform going, I want to start doing some good with it. But all these people, I said it in the last video about people are willing to carry signs and picket and march and all those things, but are they showing up to Big Brothers Big Sisters? Are they in your church? Are they in low-income areas, volunteering at community centers, coming to the churches in those areas and finding out what the needs are in those communities, mentoring and getting engaged in these communities from people who have the means to do so? I know that doesn't give you the sense of virtue that calling somebody racist does. But it actually does good for those people. If you have the opportunity and you have the capability and you have the heart for it, it's very difficult. Foster, adopt. I'm adopted. Foster, adopt. There are plenty of children waiting for. We can take actual action. There's enough people in this country who are successful and have means to solve these problems that we can solve them without looking to the state. So those are just some of the things I wanted to mention as far as how do we get across, how do we solve these? Mentoring is a huge deal, is a big deal to me because I grew up in a pretty crummy area. We were relatively low income. I grew up in a pretty crummy area. And that's all I thought the world was. And most people, what the world they live in, that's the whole world to them. They have a very limited perspective of what it's like in other places. So if you're born and raised in relative wealth, man, everything seems super easy. I don't understand why there are poor people. Those people should go and get involved in those communities and find out. But if you're born poor, it's very hard to understand how to get from that to something better, especially if you don't have somebody who can point you in that direction. And look, I'm not talking about this is how you become a millionaire. I'm saying, hey, I'm a master plumber. Here's the path I took. Let me go share that with some kid who may not know that that's a path for him or her. So mentoring, huge. It's just huge to show somebody an alternative to the life that they're living, an alternative world to the one that they're living in. So I still believe that the overwhelming arch of critical race theory is incorrect and that it provides incorrect solutions. The last thing from this chapter was a brief discussion on reparations. That's an absolute non-starter for me. It's a horrible idea. I wouldn't even bring it up in conversation. You want to talk about reparations, then you are not trying to solve problems. You're trying to sell fantasy and victimhood and a sense of entitlement, and you're not helping the people you're selling that to. So I have a real problem with any conversation on reparations. I'm not even going to stay on it here very long. It's economically impossible. It's unfeasible. There's no way to determine who owes what to whom. There's no way to work that into the system. All we can do is take it upon ourselves to try and make the world around us a better place. But you're not going to go to the government and say, print a bunch of money and hand it out. That's not problem solving. Not even close. So that's my take on chapter 3. As always, thank you very much for being here. Like, subscribe, share, turn on notifications. But I tend to start on the topic of the chapter. You'll find this if you follow along with me as I go through this book. I'll hit on a few things, and I try and steer it into a conversation about what's going on today and how we can solve some of today's problems. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Chapter 4, I'm gonna have that out by Tuesday, but I will do a video tomorrow. There's just gonna be kind of headlines, another topic I've been thinking about. I'm going to hit on wokeism a little bit and kind of why that's a very, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous. I'm going to start hitting on some headlines, probably on my in-between doing book chapters. I'm going to start doing some of that stuff. So again, subscribe so you don't miss out on any of that stuff. If you're looking for content with kind of a libertarian lean to it, you're trying to better understand the mind of libertarians, or you're not familiar with them, as I go through this, maybe you'll gain a better perspective of how we think. Again, thanks for coming by. Next video will be out here in just next video tomorrow, and then chapter 4 on Tuesday. Thanks a bunch, and have a good day.